welcome back from lunch. Would like to just briefly introduce the chair of our next session, Cinnamon Dornsife. She's a senior advisor of the International Development Program and a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute here at SAIS. She specializes in sustainable development, social entrepreneurship, and international financial institutions, has a lot of experience in the region, spent some 14 years, I think, in Indonesia, with the Asia Foundation, with Asia Development Bank. Really thrilled to have her here with us today and joining this session. Also, I was delighted to learn that she knows almost all of our speakers today, and so it's really looking forward to a nice discussion that really brings in the bigger powers in the area, in the region, and some of the problems that we've been sort of discussing on the sides or on the margins, but the issues that are connected to, for example, ROK-Japan relations, connected to the ongoing trade dispute between the United States and China, and what this means for Korea and its broader efforts to promote trade and security cooperation with South and Southeast Asia. So with that, I turn it over to Professor Dornsife. So thank you very much.
Thank you all, and welcome back, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to start with just very brief introductions of our panelists. I'm going to start with Ambassador Stapleton Roy to my immediate right. He was the founding director emeritus and a distinguished scholar at the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. And that ties back in with one of his early diplomatic accomplishments, which was to participate in the secret negotiations that led to the establishment of the U.S. PRC diplomatic relations in 1978. He's also holding the rank of career ambassador, has served as ambassador to Singapore, China, and Indonesia. He's a fluent Mandarin speaker, but I also understand he speaks Mongolian and also has studied Russian. So quite the linguist, which is in addition to all of his diplomatic accomplishments. He's also served as Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research, and I've had the pleasure of working with him in the U.S.-Indonesia Society. I'm still associated with that group, a member of their advisory council, but Ambassador Roy stepped down as the American co-chair a couple of years ago, but it's really great to have you back in my circle. I'm going to then go to Ambassador Lee, who's sitting in the center of the table. He's an expert on regional integration in Southeast Asia and China-ASEAN relations, and he's also a career diplomat and held position of ambassador to Indonesia from 2005 to 2008, and as the Deputy Foreign Minister for Policy Planning and International Organizations for the South Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This is my first time meeting Ambassador Lee, but I can already tell you that I am quite impressed with, although he is now currently retired, he still maintains a great interest and indeed expertise in the region. And he's going to kick us off with a PowerPoint presentation after I introduce Arvind Subramanian. He is currently a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute, just right across the street, and a visiting lecturer in public policy at Harvard University's Kennedy School, but not included on the bio before you. He was also a distinguished faculty member here at Johns Hopkins SAIS and taught for the International Development Program, a very well-received course, obviously asking some of the deep questions. He was awarded the title of one of the world's top 100 global thinkers in 2011 by Foreign Policy magazine, and indeed had a very senior position bringing some of those ideas to the attention of the top leadership of the Indian government. He served as chief economic advisor. He also oversaw publication of the annual Economic Survey of India and focused on major reforms such as increasing public investment, implementing uniform goods and services tax, and codifying the inflation targeting of the Indian regime. So he has written a couple of books, which are listed in our background, that just provide further credence to his deep credentials for enlightening us today as we explore all of the issues that were brought up this morning, and indeed that Ambassador Lee is going to highlight for us in his presentation. So, Ambassador Lee, I turn the table over to you and for your presentation.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. And my thanks go to SAIS and KDI School for inviting me to this conference. Thank you very much. And just have, I thought I can make it a 20 minutes presentation, but I should make it short. That's so we can have more time for Q&A. So I'll come to directly come to my presentation. My presentation is the U.S. Free and Open Indo-Pacific. As you can see, the title, I added two words, is sustainable strategy. That is big question mark to me. When I prepare for this presentation, all the way the big question mark is really this in FOIP. Free and open Indo-Pacific is sustainable or not? The reason is I've been, as I was introduced, I've been retired from the foreign ministry, and last 10 years, I frequent trips to Southeast Asia and witnessed China's expansion of their influence in Southeast Asia and ASEAN countries. That was, I've been watched for 10 years. So when I hear that strategy from the American side, really American can really offer a good platform to deal with the interference or intervention from the American and the Chinese side in Southeast Asia. That was my big question mark. So maybe I will come to. So as you can see, to Southeast Asia and to ASEAN and Southeast Asia, the most desirable. Most desirable scenario is U.S.-China hold each other in check in Indo-Pacific. That is the most desirable one. But in reality, the ASEAN and South Korea is pressured to choose China or America. There's big issues too. In my conversation with the Southeast Asian peoples, there's big question mark. That is very strategic issues, but it comes on daily basis, like Huawei. So many businessmen is affected by a ban on the U.S. ban on the Huawei, and we also South Korea is suffering from the third case. You understand is the defense missile deployment of South Korean. We got bashed by the Chinese side quite a long time. It still is there, and many more. Not just the theoretical or strategic issues, but on a daily basis they are suffering. Suffering, but they are pressured to choose either of them. So we, as South Korea and America is in alliances, really what we wish is America offer the good platform to stand in the region, to get together with the friend countries or alliances with the American. But to me, maybe to my dismay, it's not the case. So I will check why I'm saying this was I would like to evaluate the performance of U.S. FOIP in ASEAN. I emphasize the U.S., underline the U.S. FOIP, because many other countries, Japan, have their own FOIP, and Australia, India, they have their own FOIP. So, but what I'm saying is focus on the FOIP proceeded offered by the American side. I evaluated from 3 dimensions. One is ASEAN perception, how the ASEAN perceive American FOIP, and what is the economic performance of China and America in ASEAN. And the last one is some problems of the FOIP, U.S. FOIP. The 3 dimensions I will check one by one. First, ASEAN perception. As you can see on the bottom, that is based on the 2019 survey report by ISES. You know, it's a well-known research institute of Singapore. They made an interview with around 1,000 experts in the region from ASEAN 10 countries. And this is a result of the survey. First, American confidence in the USA, the 10,000, about 70% of that respondents say is no, unsure or little confidence in U.S. reliability. That's 5 years ago. It's when it was an Obama administration. That is 70% may say we believe in the American reliability. But now it's quite 70% unsure or little confidence. That was the respondent from the ASEAN expert. How about then China? What their perception of China? 45% say there's a revisionist power in the ASEAN. And 35% say it's alternative regional leadership to America. So still, ASEAN is the alert Chinese the expanding of power in Southeast Asia, but they now recognize the reality that China is now as kind of the alternative to American presence. That is the case. That is the general idea, general perception of the China. The next is on the, to be more specifically, FOIP. That is American, the U.S. FOIP. Their responses was unclear, and that's 61%. 61% says responded is unclear and they require further elaboration. That means America is now said what is not clear to the ASEAN peoples. So ASEAN is not Americans offer not good product to ASEAN. And personally also, to me, not clear, and further elaboration is needed. Then how about on Belt and Road initiative by Chinese side? There's mixed feelings. One is 31% or 30%, 35% is kind of the beneficiary. It's good to them. But another 30% is say very neutral. It's early to say anything about the BRI. But 47% is negative. There is a Chinese intention to bring ASEAN as the sphere of the influence. There is suspicious intention is behind. That's so their perception on the BRI is very mixed one. That is the perception of the ASEAN. Second one is the economic presence in Southeast Asia and ASEAN. from China and from the USA. First, the investment. U.S. investment in 2017 is 329 billion U.S. dollars. And one thing I bring your attention is American U.S. investment in ASEAN is greater than U.S. investment in China, U.S. investment in Korea, U.S. investment in Japan combined. So Denmark, the greatest U.S. investment, the area is ASEAN. So big the American presence in the ASEAN. That is $329 billion. On the other hand, the BRI, the Chinese BRI, is by 2017 is $740 billion. But I think it's very conservative numbers. To my experience, is much bigger than these numbers, and it's, they come in direct unregistered investment through their ethnic Chinese and Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is ethnic Chinese very rich in Indonesia, Philippines, and Malaysia, very rich, and sometimes they don't want revealed their investment or their cooperation with the mainland China. So if that is included, I think the number is much bigger than this one. And plus, nowadays, in a couple of years, China's investment, private investment, is increasing very sharply in recent years. Then trade. ASEAN, the total trade, 17% of the ASEAN total trade is 70% with the trade with China, and 9% is with America. And one thing is the numbers. Trade with China is increasing; its share is increasing. But on the other hand, the share of the United States is decreasing in recent years. That is a trend. And there's more technology. It's disband U.S. ban, Huawei, ban on the Huawei, Chinese technology company. But Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand say we will still use Huawei in the 5G network plans. Most of the 10 ASEAN countries, they have planned to construct their 5G networks until next year. But 5 countries already declared, no matter what their decision by the American side, we will use Huawei technology. And the tourism, e-commerce, just the e-commerce, that part. Alibaba is invested $4 billion in Lazada Group of Thailand. That is the largest e-commerce operator in Southeast Asia. And second largest, third largest of the Thailand is emerged with the Chinese the e-commerce companies. So when we think of the infrastructure investment by Chinese, it's well known, but actually on e-commerce and trade and tourism, that is also spreading very, very steadily in Southeast Asia. And some problems concerning the U.S. FOIP. First, in my talks with the Southeast Asian people, they don't understand what is the purpose of the FOIP. That is to prevent China from growing the U.S. rival, or just to enhance American interest in Southeast Asia, not in Indo-Pacific. That the purpose or objective, policy objective is not clear to Southeast Asian peoples. And the discord among the Quad, that's you understand, India, Australia, and Japan is also a part of but they are not the identical concept of the FOIP. And the third one is very provocative. I'm sorry to. It's again about President Trump. He didn't show up. Someone says benign neglect to Southeast Asia FOIP. Even it was proposed by himself in 2017. But we didn't hear much about the FOIP from President Trump. And he didn't show up in the East Asian summit. Then all the leaders, President and the Prime Minister is attending that meetings. No any countries is missing that occasions. But President Trump is only didn't attend the 2017 EAS summit, 2018. Still, we have November again in Thailand, but we didn't end news that President will attend that meeting. Maybe that means he may not go there again. 5 minutes, thank you. So it's the ASEAN scholars and people say they feel humiliated because all the president and prime minister is there, but why president the USA send the vice president representing America? They feel some humiliated. That's their expression, not my expression. That is quite the U.S. stance is quite contrast with the Chinese. China is very clear objectives was offered by Chinese side, and they using the mixed tools of the stick and the carrot. You understand stick and carrot. If you are listening to me, I will give them the economic assistance. If you're not listening to me, I'll give punitive measures. So South Korean, and after we agreed to deploy the THAAD missile defense system in South Korea, according to some estimations, maybe $7 billion is a loss, economic loss on the Korean side. It's a big loss. So if you need help, just listen to me. If you're not, we'll take ready for take their stake. That tool has worked, I think, in Southeast Asia as well as in East Asia. Okay, 2 minutes. So we have the official response to U.S. The official response. Official response is to U.S. FOIP is, as is also the previous speakers touched on this part. I skipped that. Just on two things. Key points of the ASEAN opinion outlook on the Indo-Pacific was first, they don't want a military confrontation in that the Indo-Pacific region. They would have just the economic connectivity. And the second one is not the inclusiveness principles. That means they don't want to exclude China and other countries. We just, everybody should be included. That's the key message of the ASEAN official response to FOIP. Okay, this is my last.
Okay, very good.
And my suggestion is maybe the U.S. government is really have to increase their dialogue with the South Korean on concerning the U.S. FOIP. But my personal the suggestion was two: just wait and see until, as the ASEAN say same thing, until the FOIP get more clearer, or we can hear a more clear message from the President Trump. We better not move. just wait and see. That's the policy I suggest to my government. And second one is we have to take into consideration limit of South Korea's ability. South Korea has to prepare to assist North Korea just in case of denuclearization is proceeding in the years to come. So we have no capacity to expand so many things in FOIP, in Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. We have no capacity. We just prepare for take care of North Korean economic development. That is the suggestion I made to my government. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Ambassador Lee. Okay, we're going to run this as a roundtable discussion, and I'm going to start with a couple of questions for each of the panelists. And Ambassador Lee, I invite you to join us back here at the table.
Sure.
More comfortable. All right. So, Ambassador Roy, I'm going to start with you. And just in response to Ambassador Lee's suggestions, do you agree that this FOIP is in need of further clarification?
Yes, I do. Let me expand on that just a bit. I thought Ambassador Lee's presentation was very helpful. He provided a lot of statistics and attitudinal issues. I've been thinking about this topic from a sort of more conceptual basis. And this is very relevant to the topics that Ambassador Lee was talking about. Free and open Indo-Pacific. There's a built-in problem with that concept. I would put forward the proposition that in foreign relations, there are only two constants. One is human nature, and one is geography. Human nature is the same everywhere. Geography is different everywhere. And that helps you to understand how history has developed over the millennia. It's those factors interplaying with each other. The geography of the Indo-Pacific region has created separate orders in Northeast Asia, in Southeast Asia, and in South Asia. During the period from 1959 until 1999, I had 4 assignments in Southeast Asia, 5 assignments in China-related posts, Hong Kong, 2 assignments in Taiwan, 2 assignments in Beijing, and an assignment in Moscow. So I'm very interested in this concept. But for 30-plus years, I've been attending conferences trying to integrate South Asia into East Asia discussions, and every one of those conferences has failed. In South Asia, the issues have to do with India and Pakistan. In Southeast Asia, the issues have to do avoiding dominance by former colonial powers or by rising powers, etc. And Northeast Asia has been a cockpit of conflict among major powers in which Korea has been the victim. And it's still the victim because it's a divided country and wants to be reunited. You can serve in Southeast Asia for decades and not have to worry a bit about Northeast Asia. And in Northeast Asia, you can be ignorant of Southeast Asia and get away with it. And the same thing applies in South Asia. So the question is, we're trying to come up with a scheme which links, in a sense, incompatible regions. If you look at history, South Asia has never been a factor in the East Asia balance of power. You can't find another geographic region in which neighboring major powers haven't been at war with each other, except in Asia. Because the first significant conflict between Indian civilization and Chinese civilization was in 1962. Whereas in Europe, you had Hannibal marching across the Alps, and you had conflicts among all of the neighboring countries going back. So how does one think conceptually about the region? Well, here's where Indonesia is relevant. I arrived in Indonesia in 1996, and until December of 1997, I could not find a single Indonesian at any level of society who could offer a single useful thought about what would come after Suharto. He had been the president of Indonesia for 30 years, and everybody had grown up under Suharto, and their minds simply couldn't focus on what came after him. But the financial crisis hit in 1997, and in December of 1997, President Suharto became deathly ill. And there was a question whether he would be able to recover. So for the first time, Indonesians had to think about what comes after Suharto. Mm-hmm. Well, Suharto recovered, and he had an election in 1998 and was reelected as president, except the Indonesians have begun to think about Indonesia without Suharto, and he was a lame duck. He could never recover his power because Indonesians had already thought about how Indonesia could deal without him. Well, in some ways, that's what's happening with the United States now. Talking about an East Asian order without the United States or with a lessened role of the United States was unthinkable a very short time ago. But now we have very successfully created doubts in the minds of the East Asians about American reliability. And so, for the first time, major countries of Asia and minor countries of Asia are wondering how they can look after their national interests in a situation where you cannot be confident of what the American role will be. So that's why it's so important for Korea to be exploring with ASEAN and India the question of, is there relevance now between these regions? And I would argue there is relevance. And the principal relevance is conflict avoidance. And here is where thinking is still developing. For example, you see a lot of loose talk about war between America and the United States and China. This is nonsense. During the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, we never had direct conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union because we were both major nuclear powers and we had mutual assured destruction that prevented us from getting into direct conflict. So you could either have minor, controllable, conventional conflicts, or you fought proxy wars. Well, the proxy wars were in East Asia, where we fought in Korea, and the Soviet Union and China were our enemies there. But with China, we were in direct conflict. With the Soviet Union, we were not. And in the Vietnam War, China and the Soviet Union were supporting North Vietnam, and we were supporting the South. But we were not in conflict directly with the Soviet Union. With China, we cannot get into a direct conflict because both of us have the capability to inflict unacceptable damage on the other side. So why do you pick up your newspapers every day and talk about how the Americans, think that conflict may be inevitable between the United States and China? This is nonsense. What can happen between the United States and China is either minor conflicts, as in the South China Sea, or proxy wars, where various Asian countries get into conflicts with each other, and we in China might be on the opposite sides of the question. So it really is important to try to prevent those types of conflicts from emerging, and that's where Korea and Southeast Asia can find a common interest. And in talking to India also, India is not likely to be relevant in any conflict in East Asia. But the spillover effect, the way it might affect the balance of power in East Asia, is very relevant to India. Now, why is ASEAN relevant? Because ASEAN has been the creator of the new order in East Asia ever since the Asian financial crisis. And it's only recently where China has begun to put forward its own concepts of structuring East Asia, but only in the economic sphere have these taken hold. In the Belt and Road Initiative and in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The concept of a new order for Asia, of a new order for the Asia Pacific, put forward by Xi Jinping, no progress. It's ASEAN who has come up with the ASEAN Regional Forum, with the East Asia Summit, and these new institutions that enabled all of the countries of East Asia and South Asia to get together for these regional summits. Korea has an interest in not again becoming a victim of great power conflict. And so it needs to benefit from an East Asian order in which ASEAN can play an important formative role. But we shouldn't get diverted into unrealistic expectations that India somehow is going to become a major force in East Asia. And the question of China, is it going to become a major force in the Indian Ocean? Well, here's where geography becomes relevant. In peacetime, China can become a major naval power. But in wartime, if China's naval forces are west of the Strait of Malacca, they are isolated. They can't get back to their home ports. Because in history, China has always been a land power. It never controlled the maritime portions of East Asia. Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia, China never brought those under its control. And if you look at the geography of East Asia, you discover China does not control the key straits that permit entry into the East China Sea and the South China Sea, and it doesn't control any of the island chain. The first island chain from Japan down through Taiwan and on to the Philippines, and the second island chain that comes down through the Marianas and Guam. So China has a terrible problem in facing a major conflict situation because of its geography. But in peacetime, it can become very strong. But East Asia has never been subject to dominance by a single power. Europe also. Big wars resulted and failed to establish a dominant power. East Asia, Japan tried most recently in history and failed. Soviet Union, Russia has interest in East Asia. India has interest in the balance in East Asia. The United States has historic interests in East Asia. The United States was never able to become a dominant power in East Asia. We were dominant in air and naval power, but our wars in Korea and Vietnam showed clearly that we couldn't dominate the region because China was too strong and not subject to our dominance. China is going to encounter the same problem. It cannot dominate East Asia, and if it tries, it will result in conflict, but probably not direct conflict, but through its friends and allies in the region with the friends and allies of some other major powers. And this is where ASEAN and Korea can be decisive factors in trying to head off that type of conflict. So there are some really big issues involved in this, but we can waste a lot of time thinking about the wrong issues. You're not going to end up with defense alliances between South Korea and ASEAN countries that will have any meaningful relevance to the balance of power in East Asia. But the final point, the United States is not thinking seriously about the region. And you are unbelievably lucky that President Trump has not attended any of the East Asian summits. How would you prepare him for the meeting? You can't get 15 minutes with him on the same subject. And he would not be able to talk about any of the issues that all of the other people present at the conference could talk about without reference to their briefing notes. So this is a very strange situation for the United States, where we do not have a foreign policy process. We only have policies and strategies on paper, but in reality, the president does what he wants to do. And therefore, you cannot talk about an American policy at the moment. So this concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific is a paper concept, which the United States cannot turn into any meaningful relevance. But let's look at it from the standpoint of the Asians, not from the Americans. You have nuclear powers in Northeast Asia now. You have China, Soviet Union, and North Korea. You have India and Pakistan in South Asia. Big issue, nuclear proliferation. Because of North Korea's nuclear capability, the danger is that proliferation spreads to Japan, South Korea, and then it might move south. Indonesia is a big country in the south. It's played around with the idea of going nuclear, but has backed away from it. But it's very important to try to keep the non-nuclear parts of the region non-nuclear, because otherwise it becomes much more dangerous. So that's an important factor. And trying to maintain free and open trade in the region is also very important, and here the Americans are not playing a constructive role. So this is an area where Asians themselves can show some leadership, and that's where your experience comes in, because Ambassador
Dornsife.
I call you Cinnamon.
Ambassador Cinnamon.
Ambassador Cinnamon has relevance. But in any event, I'm sorry I talked too long, but I really think that this is an exciting topic. But we have to be careful to think about it in terms that are relevant to what is doable, and not get diverted into thinking that you can come up with new structures in which the ASEAN countries and Korea can somehow control what goes on. But what you can do is guide what goes on, to try to prevent the more powerful countries from moving in directions that will be detrimental to your interests, and you actually can have significant influence in that area.
Thank you. That was a very comprehensive answer to my question about whether, in fact, the free and open Indo-Pacific needs clarification. And I really appreciated your insights, Ambassador Roy, on geography, because I think we tend to forget some of the most obvious factors that are at play here, and also of human nature. And about, seriously. And so, Professor Subramanian, I'm going to come to you with a question that you may interpret broadly or narrowly. I'm hoping you're going to interpret it broadly, while also feeling free to respond to some of the ideas that Ambassador Lee and Ambassador Roy have already raised. But my question to you is, from an Indian government perspective, or from your own perspective, having advised the Indian government, what is your view on this new Southern policy as promoted by South Korea, and the relationship between South Korea and India that is envisioned? And how pragmatic is that? Where are some of the opportunities? Where are some of the challenges? And as I said, feel free to interpret this very broadly.
First of all, thanks a lot for having me here. It's wonderful to listen to so much wisdom and knowledge on the region. I'm afraid, full disclosure, I know very little about Korea or the whole non-economic dimensions of what's happening in this whole Indo-Pacific region. So as much to kind of duck the question as to elaborate on this in a more broad sense that you urged me to do. Let me just step back and say how kind of I think about the world these days, because the world is so complex and things. So, and I will get to your question, but I think it's worth asking, I think, 3 or 4 bigger questions, before we come to the specific one that you have. And it's of importance to all of us, regardless of which particular region, sub-region in Asia we're looking at. I think the first big question that I ask and all of us ask is, does Trumpism survive Trump? And I think a lot hinges on this, including whatever new orders or non-orders we're going to get, disorders we're going to get. And to that, I think most of us have an answer, which is that, leaving aside the trivial things like, whether he shows up for meetings or not, and whether that's a good thing or bad thing, or things like him kind of even taking action against his own partners and allies, which I think will be different without President Trump. But the underlying Trumpism, 2 dimensions of the underlying Trumpism survive Trump, in my view. One is the whole anxiety about globalization, about immigration, the rise of inequality around the world, the populism, the polarization, and all that they kind of entail for, foreign policy, trade engagement, so on. So I think that survives President Trump. Second, I think more germane to these discussions perhaps, is that the kind of anxiety about China definitely survives Trump, because there is kind of, I don't want to overstate this, but there is a sense of a broad bipartisan consensus that China, quote unquote, is a problem, because I think we're forgetting the very simple fact that this is at the bottom about hegemonic rivalry, and one hegemon doesn't like to be displaced by another hegemon. The sense that, Saint Augustine famously said, Lord, give me chastity and penitence, but not yet. I think that the U.S., and the West are saying, yes, we want all these poor countries to grow like China, but not too much. They've grown too much, and now they're beginning to threaten us. So I think the whole anxiety about China survives Trump. So now, which leads me to the second, and I think perhaps the big question, also very relevant here. When we think about new orders, or, and I'm not saying capital O, but whatever sub-orders, and I know nothing about the security, but just thinking about in terms of trade and economics, should we be thinking about any new order without the US, but with China, or without the US and without China? How does the rest of the world coalesce and come together? At least in the trade world, and there are 2 views on this. The one view, perhaps which I am more sympathetic to, and which I wrote about in my last Project Syndicate column, is that I think we're kind of in a G-2 world, in the sense that both the big powers, instead of supplying global public goods, are actually supplying global public bads. If you think about the U.S., withdrawing from Paris, tearing up agreements, taking action against whatever, we know all that. But there is a sense in which, China could be seen as trying to supply, not consciously, but de facto also supplying public bads. But maybe to be fairer to China, it's a combination both that it's a hobbled hegemon, because there are lots of things that militate against it being a true, and I mean hegemon in a Charlie Kindleberger sense of providing global stability. It's too poor before it's become too strong before it's too poor. It's become too strong without, and it's aging. It doesn't have the soft power things that make it a kind of hegemon that others will readily follow. So it's a hobbled hegemon, but also you could argue, some would argue that it's doing things that make it, if, for example, it doesn't have, a hegemon usually has completely open markets. It doesn't indulge in all this kind of behavior on technology and intellectual property and so on. So there is a kind of, if you think that there's a G-2 world, then the rest of the world will have to say, look, how do we proceed without these two? But at least on the trade side, the other view would be that, look, actually the country that's really supplying the global bad is the US, not China. China is still quite responsible. China wants to be part of all these trade agreements. It's not tearing up any trade agreements. It is undertaking all these things like BRI, which, whatever you may think about it, do have some public good. And therefore, we should think of a world, actually some kind of new orders with China very much centrally in the table. Now, which leads me to my third question, of course, is, how should Asia be thinking about this, in the broader context of without both or just without the US? And I think Ambassador Roy's, a geography point, I think if I may crudely kind of summarize what you're saying, without all the sophistication, I think there is no Asia. That's the bottom line. I think from what, there are Asias and Asias and Asias, and it's very different. Just as the BRICS were a ridiculous coming together of disparate countries, Asia is also completely disparate. So there is no such thing as Asia, and the world has to move on. But I think a sub-question within that for me now, which I think we've kind of a little bit lost track of, that I do think that Asia, whether it was ASEAN, ASEAN Korea, India was looking east for a long time as well, that Asia, as in a sense, as the center of some integration process, was credible and was happening because there was an underlying dynamism in Asia. I think the new reality of the world when we think about these things is that, Asia is not the dynamic thing that it was even 5 or 10 years ago. China is slowing down. Korea is slowing down, I'm told. India is slowing down and probably growing not very rapidly. And so even when we think about, it's easy to integrate and engage when the pie is growing, but when the pie is not growing, integration becomes a different ballgame. I'm not saying it's less important or more difficult necessarily, but it is a very different ballgame. So against these kind of broader questions, we come to your specific question on, India. And these. So for about 10, 15 years, I think India has been looking decisively east. And one manifestation of that was India has negotiated lots of free trade and economic partnership agreements with ASEAN, with Singapore, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So it's been... but I think there are 2 or 3 new dimensions to all of this. First, RCEP is now a kind of a new, because when you spoke about, or Ambassador, and you spoke about, China's initiatives, BRI, etc., but RCEP is very much a Chinese initiative, a trade initiative, to kind of as a counterpart to its BRI initiative.
It's actually an ASEAN initiative that's endorsed by China.
Exactly. But I think India certainly views it as something with a big Chinese presence in it. So the question of my question of whether you should think about integration agreements with China center stage or not, I think becomes a big question. And I think the truth is that India is conflicted on this question of RCEP. I think for 1 or 2, I think fairly legitimate reasons. I think that there is the sense in which, India is willing to negotiate free trade agreements with ASEAN and Korea and Singapore. Of course, now there's a lot of, I think, questioning of that happening, even for those agreements within India. There's a big debate on whether these were successful, these helped, or whether they led to, kind of deindustrialization in India. So all these debates going on, and I'll end with that. But there is a sense in which, joining RCEP is kind of exposing Indian industry to this Chinese juggernaut, and the anxiety that India will kind of be decimated by Chinese imports, Chinese unfair practices, including undervalued exchange rates. And if you look at the pattern of trade between India and China, it's like what you would think of between a core and periphery, which is that India exports raw materials and imports a lot of finished products, and there's a massive bilateral trade imbalance between India and China. India and the US are broadly in balance, but the bilateral trade balance. So, these days everyone is looking at trade in mercantilist terms. So there is a sense in which opening to China will reinforce this asymmetry, and therefore there's a lot of anxiety. Coupled with that is the sense that opening Chinese markets and services has proven to be very difficult. So India comparative advantages in services, not in manufacturing, but you join RCEP, which doesn't open to services as much as India's comparative advantage want, then you kind of say, what's the kind of mercantilist gain from this in all of this? So there are, I think, deep and legitimate anxieties for India about joining RCEP, and that's what's saying. I think the last kind of India-specific point I would say is that I think if you look at India over the last 5 or 10 years, at least the last 5 years, what you see is this strange and interesting approach to globalization, where we've encouraged and really opened up foreign direct investment. The Indian foreign direct investment regime is very, very open now, and India has attracted much more FDI than it used to in the past. I think once upon a time, the ratio between Chinese and Indian FDI used to be something like 10 to 110 billion. Now, India, I think, on average, gets about $40 to $50 billion of FDI every year, which is now approaching Chinese levels because China's FDI levels are coming down. But on trade policy, over the last 4 or 5 years, India has in a departure from the policy of slow but steady integration, it has kind of reversed itself and has started imposing more barriers to trade. So in a sense, on trade, India's a little bit regressing, but on FDI, it's kind of very open. The big question for India, I think, and this is going to be what is going to play itself out over the next few years, is that part of the reason that India's growth slowdown has happened compared to a really boom period in the 2000s was that trade growth has basically collapsed. India's trade in the 2000s used to grow at something like 15% in dollar terms every year. So 15% growth. Now it's down to about 4% growth. It's just completely, or maybe even less. So really, India has to make up its mind on, in order to revive its growth, is it going to go back to, trying to get an export-based strategy for growth or not? And if it's really serious about that, then of course complementing the FDI openness has to be, going back to opening itself out to trade. And I don't know what's going to happen going forward. So in a nutshell, I think, therefore, I think India conceptually wants to integrate with Asia, one. It's much happier integrating with Asia without China. I think, it's very happy to integrate with Japan and Korea and ASEAN. But three, fundamentally, its ability and this to do more integration even in Asia will depend upon what kind of domestic development policy choices it adopts going forward.
Thank you very much. So I'd say you definitely took my prompt to take a very broad interpretation of where you'd like to take this discussion, and I really appreciate your asking some really big questions that are very important in the region, as related to my first question to Ambassador Roy, which was in fact in turn prompted by Ambassador Lee's suggestion about the free and open Indo-Pacific being quite vague. And so I think that to say, does Trumpism survive Trump? That's a very good question. I like your kind of the global bads as opposed to global public goods. I think that's a kind of a good insight into what's going on in the world and trying to make some sense of it. So I appreciate that. I also appreciate the insights about the dilemmas that India faces as it confronts its place in this region and indeed in the world. So Ambassador Lee, I'm going to come back to you. Thank you for setting the stage and asking some good questions and proposing a couple of recommendations. We haven't really talked so much about your second recommendation, so I wonder if you would expand about your point about South Korea needing to prepare to assist in the denuclearization process, and to just think about the context, and indeed kind of from my own perspective from Asian Development Bank, where I spent so many years, I don't think Korea needs to really think of itself as having to do this alone, but that's my own perspective. I invite you now to really expand on that and give you a couple of more moments to share your recommendations and insights.
It's on? Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
No, actually, I've been to Myanmar last 10 years, 7 or 8 times to Myanmar. Mm-hmm. One is to see the border trade between the Myanmar and China. From the Mandalay, the Muse, and to reach the Kunming. And the one other point I'm keep my eyes on the Myanmar development is Myanmar is democratization, democratized, and Aung San Suu Kyi took power, and everybody is big hand to Aung San Suu Kyi, and everybody is so happy with the democratization in Myanmar. And 3 years later, I come to Myanmar again. Last year, I checked the investment, what kind of investment that came in from the outside. I found a little surprise to me is 40% of the investment, foreign investment in Myanmar from China. 15% is Japan. Another 15% from the ASEAN countries. That means if democratization, even everyone thought is they'll pour with money, Myanmar will be hit by the big amount of the money for investment of money from ODA, assistance investment in Myanmar. But that's not true. Because most of the countries, they are investment from the private sector. Private sector, they wait until infrastructure is fully prepared. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, they will, the private sector, just only they took care of money. But the China, just take care of their strategic interest. So what I'm saying is in North Korea, if North Korea is open, so everybody will rush to make investment in North Korea. I don't believe that. Even if someone said we can have maybe McDonald's in Pyongyang, I don't believe that. Actually, the China is ready because they don't care about
what
money.
What about a Trump hotel?
So they are saying maybe it's very easy to say, but the private sector is waiting 5 or 10 years. Mm-hmm. In that 5 or 10 years, China they lose money, they don't care. Mm-hmm. They just go in North Korea, and maybe the way, it's China is to reach the so-called East Sea, to reach that is not blocked, It's on the land. The Russia and North Korea, they're blocked. They cannot go there. And the only their way is they have the railroad to reach on the East Sea part. Mm-hmm. Then they can go reach the China. So at the moment is land blocked. So China do everything to like Myanmar to reach the Indian Ocean. They spend huge amount of money to reach their own land, to reach the Indian Ocean on land. They do the same thing to North Korea. So my point is maybe if everybody is just don't worry, if there's a nuclear free, then maybe ADB will put money and the IMF will put money, America will have the McDonald's and Japan will. I don't believe that. That's why I watched Myanmar for 8 years. There I see somebody like South Korea should put money. Otherwise, it's monopolized by China. Because the South Korean also, the private sector is there only after money. They don't care about the national policy, unification policy, they don't care. And Japan, I don't believe they put their money. And North Korea, even they are nuclear-free nations. So that is, we have to prepare for certain. We cannot do whole money, but at least to a certain extent, we are ready to give assistance to North Korea. That's the way they'll be free from the Chinese, coming into North Korea and taking the whole North Korean territory. That's what I'm concerned with. That's why I'm saying that we need, we, South Korea, if you have commitment from Americans say, okay, if you denuclearization, in escrow money, we put $100 billion here, and Japan is maybe $100 billion, then maybe we can be relieved. South Korea is going to be relieved. Otherwise, we don't trust anybody else. Only North Korea give a good chance for China to come into North Korea. That's just my point.
Okay. Well, we've been charged by the organizers of today's gathering to really think about some of the bigger questions out there. The Republic of Korea and Japan's fraying relations. We've been asked to think about U.S.-China trade dispute. And I'd say that that's come up during this freewheeling roundtable discussion. But I'd like to ask you, Professor Persson, did you want to maybe direct us in that direction? Would you like? Very good. All right, fantastic. So you've all been very patient, waiting for us to put forward some ideas, and maybe some provocative ideas have gotten you thinking about things in a different way. And so I open it to the audience to maybe bring up some questions for us to consider, and you may certainly feel free to direct them to me as well. So the floor is open. Yes, sir. Right here. And we'll follow the pattern from the morning. We'll take 2 or 3.
So I'm wondering, really great panel. I mean, the whole day has been great. But I'm wondering in terms of U.S. and China, I think the common parlance in this town is competition. We call China a competitor, not an enemy per se, at least for most people in Washington. But I wonder what would move the U.S.-China relationship and U.S.-China influence, global influence, from competition to armed conflict. Now, I agree with Ambassador Roy. It's like very unlikely. I think China, the Communist Party of the Chinese Communist Party, is more focused on internal stability than political expansion of China. But what I see is a huge difference in ideology, a huge difference in like fundamental values. Whereas with the U.S., our concepts of property, ethics, pluralism, minority rights, rule-based society, even in the in business, opportunities, entrepreneurship, based on rules. On the other hand, you have China, which is authoritarian rule. We see what's going on with the Uyghurs and ethnic Kazakhs and other ethnic Muslims. Their business practices, duplicitous, manipulative. Would it ever result in a conflict? And would, like, South Korea or India end up being forced to choose sides. In case of South Korea, it's just literally in between the two, and with China being its #1 trading partner. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, sir. Vikram?
Vikram Nehru from SAIS.
Of course.
Thank you very much for your terrific contributions today in this panel. I have two thoughts, one to Ambassador Roy and one to Arvind. To Ambassador Roy, I thought your comment about China's geography was absolutely spot on. But what about the point that was touched on by Ambassador Lee? That is that China seems to be playing a long game in developing alternative outlets to develop a true two-ocean navy. The first, of course, is its strategy in the South China Sea. I've just come from a presentation which lays out the huge investments that are taking place to make sure that literally not a ship passes either on the surface or underwater through the South China Sea without detection and possibly immediate action by the Chinese Navy if push comes to shove. And there's also the impact of the ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone, that could extend to the South China Sea. So that's one area. And then there's the other two, which Ambassador Lee referred to, which is land outlets to Chokfu in Myanmar, as well as to Gwadar in Pakistan. And finally, a key part of the BRI initiative, which is opening up land connections to Europe. In other words, this is China trying to break out of its geography. It's a long-term game, and part of that game also is to try and get acquiescence from the South, from the countries in Southeast Asia. So to what extent has China, in a sense, got the right strategic directions in dealing with its geographical handicaps? And to what extent is the United States not able to, in any way, alter that particular strategic direction? The second question is to you, Arvind, and that is, I thought, again, your comments about India were spot on. But to what extent, given the fact that India has this proclivity for protectionism on trade, to what extent can India duplicate the strategic economic models adopted by Japan, Korea, and so forth, of ensuring that such protectionism is countervailed by appropriate policies to take away the anti-export bias, in other words, compensating for the additional costs associated with protection for exporters, so you can have the combination of integrating with the rest of the world while also dealing with protected markets at home, as seems to be so important given the Indian sort of political economy. And in that process, also having compensatory exchange rate policies to help exporters. You can have both a large import substitution sector as well as a powerful export sector. Why hasn't India developed that kind of model so it can integrate with the rest of the world and certainly with the rest of Asia, while at the same time protecting its own domestic market? Thank you.
Thank you both. I think what I'm going to do is, because as I counted it up, I think there were 4 or 5 excellent questions that have already been raised, and we'll come to you in the second round. So I'm going to start with you, Ambassador Roy, because there were a number of questions that were directed to you, particularly about competition and not the enemy, and what would move us from competition to conflict, and maybe to comment on that. And also, what about China playing the long game and kind of countering the fact of its geography through strategic investments, and anything else that you would like to comment on?
Thank you. Everybody should read President Xi Jinping's speech on upholding and developing socialism with Chinese characteristics. It makes for wonderful reading. it's a curious phenomenon that everybody refers to Xi Jinping and says he's out to rule the world and he's going to do this and do that. They never quote him. They never act as though they've read anything that he has said. Well, actually, in this speech that I refer to, he refers to a long-term competition between two systems. The Western free market system and China's concept of socialism with Chinese characteristics. And he puts it in terms of we have a long-term process of cooperation and struggle to see which system is superior. Now, when China talks long-term, Americans think maybe that means 3 or 4 years. But if you read the speech, Xi Jinping goes back to Deng Xiaoping and talks about the fact that this cooperation and struggle may last for generations, even tens of generations. And then he comments, you know, it's only been 70 generations since Confucius. And here China is talking about a long-term competition and struggle, cooperation and struggle. Well, what's significant about this is, what's totally missing from U.S. strategy in dealing with China is any reference to cooperation. And secondly, we act as though Xi Jinping is bent to dominate the world while he's president of China. And that's not what he's talking about at all. He's talking about a long term. And when I say long term, we're talking hundreds of years of competition between models. Secondly, we are assuming that China is trying to export its model. But in this speech, Xi Jinping constantly emphasizes that the China model is rooted in Chinese soil. That's literally a quote from the speech. It's rooted in Chinese soil. It emerges from bringing together the ideas of scientific socialism and China's specific experience. Well, now, how do you export something like that? What he talks about, he goes on to say, is he talks about the superiority of the West. He says we should understand how resilient capitalism is. Its ability to self-correct is something we should respect. And he says we should recognize that they have made benefits for civilization and that they're ahead of us in economics, in technology, and in military power. And that may continue for a long time. So this idea of exporting is not what he's talking about. And very specifically, he says, our goal is to demonstrate the superiority of our system. And unfortunately, in some cases, for example, I referred to cooperation and struggle. But I found the speech had been translated as cooperation and conflict. The term in Chinese is dozhang. And when I saw the word conflict, I said, I think that's wrong. I think it's the term dozhang, and dozhang really means struggle, which does not take on an automatic military connotation. And when he talks about superiority, the Chinese term is youyaxing, which is not dominance. It means having the edge, being in a more favorable position. And so he sees that as how China's influence will spread if it is able to demonstrate the superiority of its system over that of capitalism, which has delivered all of these wonderful benefits to the world, and China wants to do even better than that. Well, it's curious that we don't talk about Xi Jinping in those terms, but this is the way he's talking about these things. So my first point is, China's talking about cooperation and struggle, and we're talking about struggle, and there's no role for cooperation. In fact, cooperation benefits the other side is the way we are explicitly defining our approach to China, and it's total nonsense. It's a policy that will not gain any support because every country of Asia wants to preserve the right to cooperate with China in ways that serve their interests. And if the United States cannot align its policy approach to China with the interests of the Asian countries, then we are going to be isolated. Now, what's the characteristic of being isolated? What's our big slogan? America first. But if you're isolated, there's no difference between being first or being last. So in other words, you're only American first if you have people with you. And we're defining our policy in terms that don't create the basis for a cooperative approach in which we can draw on the interests of all of the Asian countries who don't want to be dominated by China in an effort to cooperate and struggle with China, if you will, over whose system is superior. Point number one. Point number two, what could give rise to conflict? The number one issue is Taiwan. China has made it very clear enough so we ought to pay attention, that it's prepared to use military force to prevent China from breaking out of a one China framework. Our policy is to preserve the one China framework. The Trump administration says it has a one China policy, but it's not telling the truth. In fact, it's practicing a one China, one Taiwan policy. Members of Congress have passed the Taiwan Travel Act, which says that we ought to permit our topmost officials, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, what have you, to go to Taiwan, have exchanges with Taiwan. And our commitment, the basis for establishing diplomatic relations with Beijing, is that we have an unofficial relationship with Taiwan. Not a single member of Congress seems to understand that this is a potential conflict-making issue because a non-binding Taiwan Travel Act was passed unanimously by all members of Congress. So we have a situation where China has done a very poor job in educating our political elite on the fact that Taiwan is a sensitive issue for Taiwan. Well, that means that we could, by inadvertence, by not understanding that when China says it will use force to prevent something and we go ahead and promote it, we could give rise to conflict. But our policy framework makes conflict unnecessary because American interests have been seen by every president up to the present one as so important that we have used our influence to keep Taiwan within a one China framework. So that's the question of conflict. Leaders in China and the United States are not stupid enough to go to war over rocks in the South China Sea or in the East China Sea. That could give rise to minor conflicts, but the likelihood of that escalating into something major, in my judgment, requires stupidity on the part of your senior political and military leaders that is, I hope, unbelievable, although history has some good examples of it. Second point, yes, I answered part of that. China is playing a long game, and we think that China is playing a short game. But China is creating part of the problem. It's done two things that are contributing to the issue. First, in Chinese statements, it has delinked its military requirements from its defense requirements. This, first of all, took place at the 18th Party Congress, where the work report in the section on military said, China requires a powerful military commensurate with the country's international standing, 与国家的国际地位相称的, and suitable for its defense and development needs. That first portion is very dangerous because it means the floor for China is to be able to defend itself, but the ceiling is unlimited. If China rises in status, it needs a bigger army, bigger military. Very dangerous. The second point is that Xi Jinping uses too expansive language in talking about China's role in the world. For example, at the 19th Party Congress, he did not repeat the language of the 18th Party Congress on the military, but he talked about China reaching world status by mid-century, and at that time, China will stand tall in the world and have a military, the term he used was 第一流的, meaning a military second to none. Well, why should China have a military second to none? It has no security responsibilities for any other country. It hasn't committed itself to defending countries in Africa and Latin America or Europe. In other words, this is delinking military requirements from defense requirements. This plays into the hands of people in the United States that see China as wanting not only to be the hegemonic power in East Asia, but being a hegemonic world power, developing military for that purpose. So, are these China's real goals? The answer is we don't know for sure, but we need leaders who can have serious discussions on this with China in order to see whether there is some way to accommodate a powerful China and a powerful United States in the Pacific. And here we are the deficient ones, because Xi Jinping has said the Pacific is large enough for both the United States and China. And we're saying China is posing an existential threat to the United States, and we therefore have to do everything possible to hold down China's economy, cut off Huawei from its dominant position in the global G5 development, et cetera, et cetera. We're having trouble defining our policy goals with China in ways that make sense.
Okay, thank you. I can't resist a plug for language, and for the students in the audience who are students here at SAIS, I'd say Ambassador Roy's knowledge of the Chinese language has really allowed him to be a very effective participant today, and indeed a diplomat, and more, my goodness, do I miss you at the State Department. All right, so now, Ambassador Lee, there were some questions and aspects of them that you may wish to respond to. China's long game, the kind of outlets through Myanmar and indeed to Europe, and any other points you wish to respond to.
Just the 2 points. Actually, I also spent 80 years for Chinese affairs at home and Hong Kong and the Beijing embassy, and I was as a consul general in Shanghai. But I still, in every year, I'm coming to China. I speak some Chinese. But Ambassador Roy's Chinese is a very correct pronunciation. I'm so surprised. He still uses that's a very correct Mandarin. There is many direct, but he is using really a very standard Mandarin. So 2 points I want to say is, as Ambassador Roy, we have in Northeast Asia, we have our sub-regional leader, or maybe we have some strategy by some the countries in the region. In Southeast Asia, also they have ASEAN, they have their own leadership and also their own strategy. And in the Indian Ocean, maybe India. But problem is that we need some platform linking from Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, Indian Ocean. That is nobody can to provide that the platform. That is also America has done, and we still rely on the America. So, but in that sense, we pay more attention to a FOIP. But to me, as in my presentation, is not the sellable one. No countries in the ASEAN, as Korea, South Korea, is not good product to buy. That is one point I want to say. Still, America needs offer some platform, strategic platform to region from the Southeast, Northeast, Southeast Asia, and Indian Ocean. So we hope that we have the better platform, better FOIP in the coming years. And the second point is China, and when they start in 2013, they start BRI. They're very extended from the Central Asia, Pakistan, and the South China, the Southeast Asia. But in the recent years, they make their own adjustment or reassessment. Say it's too much. They cannot accommodate all the expenses they committed to, like Africa and Pakistan and the Central Asia. So they now in the process of the reviewing and make some adjustment in the BRI project. But the one thing is clear to me, it's my assessment, they will just concentrate on Southeast Asia, the ASEAN. That's why, so America is power from the Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and the East. But if it's, Southeast Asia is taken by China, so whole platform of strategy, American strategy, may not function properly. So China is very, to me, is strategical just the point, central, because the Southeast Asia is connecting between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. They're taken by China. Then the American maybe very hard to. So China seems like spend more time. Even they withdraw from some project in Africa and in the Pakistan or in other areas, more concentration on Southeast Asia, at least to create some sphere of influence. That's the best way to maybe keep a counterpart to American strategy, global strategy, or regional strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Lee. I'm going to turn to Professor Subramanian. You may want to respond to Professor Nehru's question about Indian protectionism, strategic economic models, that sort of thing, and any other points that you wish.
Vikram had questions about basically why can't India be like Japan and Korea? And
kind of like that.
Actually, and the very good question is, why haven't we been successfully able to implement industrial policies in a way that kind of marries this tension that China and Japan and Korea pulled off, which is that you kind of protect your market, but you offset it with all kinds of other actions, incentives, targets, implementing them in a way that Korea did, for example, right? See, I think, and then of course there's the exchange question, which I'll come to in just a second. I think it's, Vikram, maybe I won't give a great answer, but I think that industrial policy of the kind that they implemented, I think requires, there are two prerequisites that India's, I think, lacking. One is a kind of state-private sector coordination that you can pull off only if you have an underlying kind of ideological zeitgeist that it won't lead to cronyism, it won't lead to capture, and all those pathologies are so rampant in India today because of a history of corruption scandals or whatever, that state-private sector coordination just becomes a thing saying, this is just crony capitalism, stigmatized capitalism. So pulling that off, I think, has been proved very difficult, but now it's going to be increasingly difficult because of what has happened in the last 20 years with all these scandals, the phone banking, the infrastructure boom that kind of went sour to some extent. Second, it requires the kind of state capacity to say, look, we will intervene, but we also have some hard targets, allowing losers to fail. If you don't meet targets, we punish, or we have some things. I don't think the Indian state is just set up that way. It cannot. Exit is impossible in India. You cannot have exit. And so I think the demands. I think we kind of the kind of state capacity demands a kind of broader backdrop of some modicum of trust and confidence that state-private sector relations can in principle be, devoid of capture, corruption, all of that. I think those things are missing. And And moreover, now more and more I realize in India is that if you want to do these things, these have to be coordinated, not just between the state and the private sector, but between the central government, the federal government, and the private sector. So there's a kind of, for example, land. If you want to say, come in, we'll give you land, that has to involve the state government, the central government. So I think it's really very, very difficult. On the other point, I have an easier answer, which is, on the exchange rate, I think it's very difficult to have an exchange rate that can compensate for import protection if you have an open capital account. I think we have, we've, over the last 20 years, we've progressively opened up our capital account in ways that China hasn't. China still is. In fact, I have a piece today in Project Syndicate with Danny Roderick on, the puzzling allure of financial globalization. So India succumbed to that long ago. So the ability to keep the exchange rate, because remember, every time there's a kind of, a Modi bump or, when confidence builds up, capital comes pouring in and, you're just not able to keep it competitive. So it's hard to have exchange rate policies as industrial policies when you have an open capital account.
Okay. All right. Yes, sir. You've been patient. Let's open it up to a couple of more questions.
Thanks. So much has been said since I was going to ask a question initially, but the first question I was going to ask, Ambassador Roy didn't think that China posed that much of a real threat around its periphery. What about Gwadar and the String of Pearls and all that investment in port infrastructure from I was going to say from Africa, but from Pakistan all around? And the second point, which came up in Ambassador Roy's later remarks, although the United States was portrayed as very short-sighted and maybe stupid, he didn't mention the unbelievable balance of trade in favor of China that's existed for many years, and he also didn't mention the whole issue of intellectual property rights and that sort of thing, sort of implying that the Huawei thing was maybe overdone and overstated. I wonder if that really is overdone and overstated, considering the acquisition of intellectual property rights, not only surrounding Huawei, but a number of other firms. So those two issues, China's rising strength around its periphery, and I use that term, string of pearls, which may be sort of outmoded, and also the whole question of this seemingly uncontrollable balance of trade that China has amassed with the United States, which was totally overlooked in previous remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Down front. Blue shirt.
Thank you. I really appreciate how you talked, this is to Ambassador Roy, how you talked about Xi Jinping's speech and how one of China's main goals is to not prove dominance, but superiority over capitalism with Chinese socialism. As they're trying to prove this to Asian countries and countries around them, how do you think what's going on in Hong Kong right now, which is at odds to this, where Hong Kong wants a democracy and a free election, how do you think China's going to choose to deal with this in the short and long term?
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions? All right, Ambassador Roy, I think they were both directed to you.
You asked, does China pose a threat to its periphery? What about Gwadar, String of Pearls, etc.? China has global ambitions. There's no question about it. There's no secret about it. It is captured by its old rhetoric of opposing foreign bases and opposing foreign military alliances. And what China is doing is trying to break out of that straitjacket. It is focusing particularly on the Indian Ocean region and the Middle East because of its energy deficiencies. It has to import over a third of its energy resources now, and that's going to get worse. China is also unlike the Soviet Union. Soviet Union had an autarkic economy. It didn't have, its foreign trade was balanced. It was largely with socialist countries. China needs international resources to fuel its growth. Now, here's an interesting thing. Permit me to divert for a moment. When the West rose, where did we get our resources? The European countries basically used military power to carve out colonies in South America, in Africa, and in South Asia, India. British prosperity rested on ruthless exploitation of the resources of India. That's historic fact. In the 20th century, the hegemonic powers who rose used military power to seize the resources they wanted. Japan, that was the reason they went south and seized the oil of Indonesia and the resources of Southeast Asia. And Hitler had a very clearly declared program of seizing both the land for Lebensraum, the living room for the German people, and the resources of the Ukraine, etc. China, curiously, which is desperately in need of international resources to fuel its growth, has done so by playing basically within the rules of the international trading system. But it's given no credit for that. All we talk about is its stealing of intellectual property. China does steal intellectual property. There's no question about it, and the United States should have been more vigorous in dealing with that problem. It was one of the weaknesses of the engagement strategy, but unlike what people are saying, it does not discredit the engagement strategy as the right strategy. It's simply that it wasn't strong enough in certain areas. The reality in the world, however, is that those who create intellectual property try to protect it, and those who don't create intellectual property try to steal it. And that's true everywhere. There is massive theft of intellectual property in the United States. If you can remember, it was only about 10 years ago when we began to crack down on the fact that college students throughout the country were stealing music off of the internet and paying no royalties for it. And when they cracked down on that, there was an uprising on our university campuses because we didn't like it. Taiwan, when I served there back in the 1960s, published all of the books and textbooks in the Encyclopedia Britannica in pirated versions, and we tried to shut it down, and they said, nuts to you. We need education, and we cannot afford to pay the costs of your textbooks, and therefore we're going to pirate them. And that's the way it was. It was official policy. In China, it's not official policy to steal intellectual property, but they do it. And it's dangerous. Soviet Union, however, don't forget that, stole our intellectual property on building atomic bombs, and that's where they got their first atomic bomb. So, and Europe, which also creates intellectual property, has probably double the level of theft of intellectual property we have in the United States, where we probably have the tightest regime. This is not to forgive China for stealing our intellectual property, but to say that their behavior pattern is, shall we say, not an aberration from the norm. And the additional point, China has ambitions to create intellectual property, and in fact is doing so. And as it creates intellectual property, its instincts to protect its intellectual property will become stronger, and that will have a positive impact on the United States. You mentioned the balance of trade in favor of China. So what? There's not an economist who knows his economics who won't tell you that dealing with a bilateral trade imbalance has no relevance. You have to look at your balance of payments. That's number one. The United States has an imbalance in our balance of payments, and that's reflected in the fact that we have trade deficits with a variety of countries. Think of Saudi Arabia. One product to export, oil. How is it going to have a balanced trade with the rest of the world when the rest of the world needs oil, and Saudi Arabia doesn't need that much in terms of the consumer goods that we provide? The question of whether or not we have less jobs to that That's a big question that we are not addressing properly. We're claiming that we have lost, millions of manufacturing jobs because of globalization. Have you seen a study that says what would the United States be like if we had used protectionist measures to tried to prevent our manufacturing jobs from leaving the United States? If we cite particular industries, what happened was when we protected our automobile industry in the United States, we discovered that our automobiles were inferior to the automobiles that were being produced outside of the United States. Those automobiles started coming in, and our automobile companies were going bankrupt. So we forced the people making better automobiles to make them in the United States. And that's the way we dealt with the problem. But the point is, if you use protectionist measures to protect manufacturing jobs that can be done elsewhere better and cheaper, you will end up with a higher cost of living, a lower standard of living, and inferior products. So, in my judgment, globalization has had a bad name because globalization has raised the world economy enormously because of the fact that it's permitted comparative advantage to operate on a global scale. And the problem with the United States and many of the Western countries is that we did not adequately allow for the change in employment patterns that necessarily flows from that. When I lived in Taiwan, it produced rice, then it moved into canned pineapples and put Dole out of business in Hawaii. And then it moved into light electronics, and then it moved all of its soft shoe manufacturing over to the mainland of China. It had 33% of our soft shoe exports came from Taiwan originally, but then they moved all of the manufacturing to the mainland. So Taiwan companies got the profits, and China got the trade deficit with the United States as a result. But the soft shoe manufacturing involved components from Southeast Asia, et cetera. Additional point. I don't know where our economists are fast asleep. We now have computers. That means you could measure trade imbalances in terms of the added value of manufacturing processes that involve chains of supply that is totally incompatible with the 19th century concept that a country produced products and exported them to other products. China may export products to us in which there's a 5% added value from China, but it gets 100% of the imbalance on the trade. We shouldn't be calculating our trade figures the way we are doing now. In the past, we didn't have the computing power to handle this. We have it now. Have you seen anybody trying to calculate international trade in terms of how much added value actually takes place in each part of the trade? No, we don't. So what you can tell from my comment is I am fundamentally out of sorts with the way that we are handling the economic issues involved with globalization, and I think we ought to do better. Huawei happens to be a highly competitive country producing superior products. It's way ahead of us in 5G technology. It has captured an international base on that basis, and it hasn't been done entirely on the basis of stolen intellectual property. In fact, the significance of China's global companies like Huawei is when they become a global player, they become subject to intellectual property cases in foreign courts. Huawei first came to my attention back 10, 15 years ago when it was sued by Cisco because it was using stolen intellectual property from Cisco in their, it was fought in Texas court. Huawei lost, paid up. Nowadays, Huawei does not just steal intellectual property, it produces superior intellectual property, and its products have taken a lot of the global marketplace. Our trying to cut off Huawei at the knees is not justified by Huawei's behavior. It's, in my judgment, an anti-competitive action by the United States that is going to hold back our 5G deployment. I am not in favor of stealing the intellectual property, but this is being manipulated, and the bilateral trade imbalance is nonsense, because you don't have naturally bilateral trade, even balanced trade with other countries, because that doesn't reflect the actual economic realities. Hong Kong. The basic contradiction of China is not the one that Xi Jinping says it is. He says the contradiction of China is the imbalance in development between the coastal areas and the interior parts of China, and that's true. The real contradiction of China is the contradiction between a modernized economy and a modernized society that has been produced by the reform and openness policies over the last 40 years, and the fact that China will not modernize its political system. Every modern political system is based on the concept that power corrupts and has to be checked and balanced, and that the just powers of governance are derived from the consent of the governed. China has a pre-modern political system. It is no different in its essence from the divine right of kings, emperors, tsars, dominant leaders in the past. Those are the pre-modern forms of governance. Power was the right of rulers to dispose as they wish, and China claims the right for the Communist Party to have a total monopoly on power, and it won't permit any sort of an electoral process in which the citizens ultimately empower the government. If you look at the G20, there are 2 countries out of the 20 members that don't have an electoral process: Saudi Arabia and China. Iran has an electoral process. And if you pay attention to Iran, the president of Iran is elected through a process where he does not necessarily agree with the Ayatollah who controls the power. Russia has an electoral process, and Putin is struggling with the problem of citizen dissatisfaction with the way it's being ruled, and he's trying to control the system, but he still has a more democratic system than you have in China. So China's fundamental contradiction is the one between a modernized society and economy and a pre-modern form of governance. And Xi Jinping is not addressing that problem. So in my judgment, that's going to get worse. Hong Kong is a symptom of that problem, because under the agreement with Britain and the basic law that provides for the special privileges that citizens of Hong Kong have that citizens of the mainland do not have, when you get more democracy in Hong Kong faster, then there is progress in producing a more representative form of governance on the mainland, you begin to create an imbalance that has the potential to destabilize China. So China is highly concerned about pressure for immediate democratization, whereas the basic law provides for full democratization at the end of a 50-year period, but it doesn't provide a timetable for how rapidly that must move. The assumption when the basic law was passed was that China would actually have a more open political system gradually. That's not the case. In fact, Xi Jinping is pushing back in the opposite direction and is using more repression in China, and there's more fear in China now because of the contradiction between the modernized system and the political system. But the curious thing about China, I just throw this out for you, is Xi Jinping is moving to the left in terms of his political and economic policies, favoring the state-owned enterprises over the private sector. But he's promoting the reformers. For example, Liu He, who was the author of the economic reform program that was Xi Jinping's first major substantive move other than the anti-corruption campaign, which goes back to 2013. And it hasn't moved forward. In 2015, there was a major editorial in a national commentary under the title Guoping, which talked about the ferocious, stubborn, perverse opposition to the party's economic reform program. That appeared in papers all throughout China. I've never seen such strong language used in a communist newspapers referring to opposition to government policies. So that gave you a sense of why the economic reform program wasn't moving forward. Who was the hero of the anti-market forces thing? Bo Xilai, who was the party secretary in Chongqing. He got caught up in corruption. He's now in jail. But at that time, he had become a national figure because the Chongqing model was of emphasizing anti-corruption and Maoist themes. In Chinese, it was called Da Hei Chang Hong. And he developed that so that everybody in China was paying attention to that, and he became a threat to the leadership. But in Guangzhou in the south, Wang Yang was the party secretary, and the Guangzhou model was rule by law and use of market forces. So who's in jail? The apostle of the Chongqing model. Wang Yang was promoted to the 4th ranking position in the Standing Committee of the Chinese Communist Party at the 19th Party Congress in 2017. So what's going on in China? Here you have a move to the left in terms of the policies of the General Secretary, but at his own party Congress, he promotes the people who are the reformers. So Liu He, who is the author of the Third Plenum Economic Reform Program, is on the Politburo now, and he's in charge of the negotiations here with the United States. But he negotiates a trade agreement with the United States and goes back to Beijing and can't get support for it. Why is that? Because these other forces are opposing that movement, and because there's no prospect of an improvement in U.S.-China relations, so the political factor is missing. So we have a real problem here in terms of doing it. Clearly, there is a two-line struggle going on in China between the modernizing forces that have been created by the openness and reform programs of the last 40 years, and the people who didn't benefit from those programs, didn't have access to Western educations, didn't learn the foreign languages necessary to function in a globalized economy, and they are the supporters of the iron rice bowls of the state-owned enterprises, and they are the ones who do not want to support the movement to the market. Xi Jinping is trying to manage this program without opening up the political system. So he's having to use fear and repression for the first time in 40 years. And we are totally ignoring those forces in China and offering nothing to the modernizing forces that we would be able to deal with more easily, because we're scared that a more modern China may actually pose a big threat to us. It's a classic example of a foreign policy going wrong because we haven't learned from Sun Tzu, who said that you need to know yourself and you need to know the other side if you want to win your battles. We are neither knowing ourselves and neither looking at the other side. I referred earlier to Xi Jinping's speech. You know what he said in terms of the competition, the struggle with the Western system? He says, we got to improve ourselves. We have to raise standards of living. We have to work harder. We have to do these things. Where is that in the U.S. approach to the competition with China? What are we doing to improve our infrastructure, our number of our R&D? China is outspending us on R&D now. They have overtaken us in the number of papers on new initiatives, et cetera, et cetera. So this is my diatribe to you.
My goodness. All right. Well, I find that we're at time. We're supposed to conclude at 3:30. But I would just like to say I've been taking in notes of all the topics we've covered. Philosophy, strategy, policy, economics, geography, regional, bilateral, global, history, language, insights into China, India, Korea, globalization. Please join me in thanking our panelists and indeed for the organizers of the conference.
Well, and thank you very much, Ambassador Dornsey, for moderating this panel. This has been fascinating.
I really like that.
And I could have listened for hours. Some of my students here will, of course, remember the time when you expressed frustration when talking about North Korea, when I mentioned the Treaty of Westphalia. And I told you about the time when I was on a panel with Ambassador Roy, And we were also talking about North Korea, and he talked about the Roman Republic. Well, here you have him today talking about Hannibal from an act in 218 BC. But thank you very much to all of our panelists today. For all of our panelists, all of our moderators, and thank you to KDIS for co-hosting this event with us today. So thank you all for joining us. Thanks.
Okay.